Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today for our inaugural Pandas and Prose, World Wildlife Fund's monthly author engagement series, where we'll be talking to notable writers who use nature and the written word to inspire readers around the world. We're so thrilled we have Jane Alexander as our first official guest. My name is Jenna Bonello, and I will be your host for today's webinar. Before we kick things off, I just have a few logistics to go over with you. This is a Zoom webinar, so your cameras have been turned off and your microphones have been muted upon arrival, but please utilize the chat feature throughout. We'll be monitoring for questions, and certainly during the audience Q&A portion of the program, please utilize the chat. This meeting is also being recorded and will be made available at worldwildlife.org following the event for anyone who wasn't able to join us today. And this event will also have closed captions throughout the event as well. So now for who you came for. I am joined today by Jeanette Hemley, World Wildlife Fund Senior Vice President of Wildlife Conservation. Jeanette has been at the front lines of conservation for over 30 years and oversees WWF's work to ensure our planet's beautiful endangered wildlife and critical habitats are protected. Jeanette leads programs to reverse the decline of iconic species, including working with local communities to ensure that people and wildlife can thrive together, and strengthening policies and laws to reduce threats like poaching and the illegal wildlife trade. Fun fact, Jeanette has seen a panda in the wild, and she's also an avid reader. Welcome and thanks to Jeanette. And now Jane Alexander, author of Wild Things, Wild Places. Again, we're so honored that she is our first guest today.
Thank you.
Jane is an actress, a writer, and a conservationist. She was most recently seen on Broadway in Grand Horizons and was honored with a Tony Award for her role in The Great White Hope. Her film career includes 4 Oscar nominations for The Testament, All the President's Men, Kramer versus Kramer, and The Great White Hope. Jane chaired the National Endowment for the Arts under President Clinton, and today spends much of her time dedicated to wildlife conservation. Her books include Command Performance, An Actress in the Theater of Politics, and Wild Things, Wild Places. But we hope that throughout the course of this conversation, you hear from Jane and learn how her experiences help shape her life, and also how the natural world is just way more interesting and exciting than anything that you'll see in the movies. So thank you so much again to Jane and Jeanette. And Jeanette, now over to you.
Thank you so much, Jenna, and thanks everyone for joining today. I've been so looking forward to this conversation. It's really the highlight for me of this week and this year for sure. Jane, thanks for your time. Really appreciate that. Let me start by saying what a treat it was to read your book, Wild Things, Wild Places, especially during this time of COVID when so many of us are rarely leaving our homes, let alone traveling to exotic places to see wildlife. And your book really provides this just wonderful vicarious journey. Where are you right now in the world? What's keeping you busy?
I'm at my home in Nova Scotia, southwestern Nova Scotia. And what's keeping me busy is really walking every day and documenting the changes in the flora and fauna, looking at the stars at night if they're out, and walking the beaches. There's lots of sea ducks around, and documenting that in a journal and taking photographs of things each day.
It's a beautiful part of the world. Well, you've had this amazing career in the dramatic arts. It's a real privilege for us to be speaking with someone, from your field. I would love to just ask, so if you could go back a little bit and tell us what led you to pursue a career in acting, and then what made you take the leap from being an avid nature lover, which you clearly are, to really being focused on conservation. And do you see a connection between the arts and conservation?
Well, what led me into acting was that my dad came home from World War II. And when I was about 6, he took me to a ballet. It was the first time I'd seen anything on stage. And I was totally dedicated from that moment on. I didn't become a ballerina, but I did become an actress. I said, that's where I want to be, up there with the lights, the costumes. And then from there, my mother was the one who really introduced the world of nature to me. I grew up in the suburbs of Brookline, Massachusetts. My father was a doctor. We lived on Pill Hill. That was the nickname for it. Everybody was a doctor or a nurse. My mother was a nurse. And I explored the backyard a lot. It wasn't big, but I learned about bugs, birds, backyard birds, suburban birds, and little mammals. And do I see a connection? Is that what you asked, Jeanette, between the arts and nature? Yes, I think the connection is, for me, exploration, discovery.
You know, that certainly comes through in your book. And I also enjoyed the parts of it that talk about what you can find in your own backyard. And I think that's, for me, during COVID, I've been enjoying getting to know just my own neighborhood, you know, in ways that you don't when you're just, you know, commuting every day to work and coming back. You don't even look, you know, at what's right around you. So those are wonderful parts of your book. But, you know, it's this fascinating look at some of the world's most incredible places that is so striking in your book. And, you know, each chapter is a real treat of really colorful and poignant insights into wildlife, but also people and culture. Did you always have in mind to write this book? And what led you to write it, and how did you do it? I mean, it covers so much geography and so many years. Did you keep a detailed journal? It's just a wonderful compilation of so many things.
Oh, thank you very much, Jeanette. I do keep a journal. I'm keeping one during this COVID year for sure. Many people are. And but whenever I took a trip from the time I was a little girl on, I've kept a journal. It helps enormously if you want to remember conversations particularly, and insights that people might have. When I got to travel with field biologists, which began really in the 80s for the most part, I was really, really interested in seeing that these scientists were switching from a role of pure research to one where they were wearing many, many hats. Conservationists, certainly. They learned that they had to, if they wanted to preserve the species that they were studying, they had to really get to work in the community in which the species lived. So that was on my mind during the 80s and the early 90s, to really document what was happening with field biologists in particular. This enormous struggle that they were going through to try to preserve the species through preserving the habitat, through preserving the love of the community in which the habitat was, or creating a desire for them to preserve the animal. So that's what really brought about my feeling to write the book, because I saw things being lost so quickly. I mean, we were losing species. We all know in the past 50 years, if we've read anything in the papers, that we've lost enormous numbers of species, not only of mammals, but 3 billion birds alone.
I mean, your experience really kind of tracks how conservation as a discipline, you know, as a movement has evolved as well. When I started in conservation, also in the 80s, most of our colleagues and the staff that were working on it, you know, were biologists, field biologists, which are obviously sort of the core part of, you know, what we do. But today, it's by necessity and by opportunity, it's become so much more diverse in terms of the skills that are needed, obviously, to achieve conservation at the scale we need. We need the biologists, we need the economists, we need the legal minds, we need the agricultural specialists, we need the social scientists. So it's really interesting how that also kind of comes through in your experience as well.
Yeah.
Well, you know, you talk a lot in your book about how real life versus pretend life on the stage or in a film is always more fascinating. You've touched on that a bit. You say in the book, quote, reality is always more interesting than any fiction, unquote. Can you tell us a little story about how this really became clear for you?
Oh, well, I'll start where I was writing a screenplay about a biologist who goes and studies jaguars in Belize. And I called up a friend of mine at the Bronx Zoo, and I said, can you give me some information about Belize and jaguars? He said, where'd you get this story? I said, I made it up. He said, well, you should go visit our scientists who's studying jaguars in Belize. So literally within a couple of days, I hopped on a plane and I met the great Alan Rabinowitz, who was a young man at the time. And he said, he tolerated me. He tolerated me and he said, come on back to my study site and we'll go out and we'll track jaguars. Well, that was the beginning of a love of the immense biodiversity of the world, and particularly in the tropics. I mean, I could not believe the number of insects, the number of amphibians, the number of reptiles. It was extraordinary, not to mention the fact that jaguars were coughing in the night outside the shack.
Well, Alan, it must have been amazing to be with Alan. He's made so many incredible contributions to conservation and science. That's a great way to have started. But you yourself you're a world-class birder by all accounts, and you've weaved together these great stories of finding some of the world's rarest birds. You talk about also, sort of the sobering side of things of how species are declining, but also about efforts to protect them. I recall in your chapter on Hawaii, you talk about taking a break while filming there in Hawaii to seek out the white-tailed tropic bird. Can you talk a bit about that, or any of these experiences where you seem to have an uncanny way of being in the right place at the right time and finding things? I mean, it really is amazing, the things you've seen.
Thank you. I think it's uncanny too. And people sometimes want to hitch their wagon to my star because they think that I'm going to see something incredible. And I don't know whether I am in the right place at the right time because I put myself there, or a field biologist puts me there, or God puts me there. But whatever happens, I do have some incredible luck. I started wanting a hobby when I was filming way back in the 70s. And my hobby, I was intensely interested in birds back in the early 70s when we moved to the country and the kids were little. And I picked up a pair of binoculars and I said, oh, this and a field guide is all I need wherever I'm filming or doing theater, in city, country, whatever. And it really was an enormously pleasurable and educational hobby. And I became passionate about birding. So when I was in Hawaii doing a wonderful mini series called Blood and Orchids, which, by the way, was about racial injustice and pretty severe. And I played the bad person, not so nice, but I took myself over to Maui, to the great volcano, Haleakala, on the far side, because I learned the white-tailed tropic bird was probably breeding at that time, and the nest is laid on the cliffs of volcanoes. And I hiked in the backside and sat there and waited and waited. And then she came through. I mean, one white-tailed tropic came through and went right behind me, right up into a cliff. I lost her, of course. I couldn't see her after there. It's a little bit of fog, but wow, what a rush.
No kidding. And you were able to get back to the film set in time for your next.
I did. Yeah, Chris Christopherson was the detective in the film, and he brought me down.
That's great. Oh boy, what a great story. One of the things I liked about your book is how you talk about the critical relationship between local communities, indigenous groups, and wildlife conservation. And I was particularly drawn to those parts of your writing, I think, because we're thinking a lot about that ourselves in World Wildlife and how important it is and how important inclusive conservation is in our work. I'd love to hear some of your reflections on that and maybe what we can learn from what you learned.
Yes. Well, the one thing that I learned also from field biologists like George Schaller, or certainly Alan, or any of them, but George Schaller for a long time has known that there is no conservation without inclusion. And George Archibald, who's the great crane expert of the world. And George Schaller is the preeminent field biologist in the world today, still very busy in his mid-80s. So you have to begin to look at the community, particularly of human beings, in which you find yourself in any habitat that you're trying to change or protect. And you have to help them understand what they have in their own backyard if they don't understand it. And it's surprising how many places don't understand what they have there. I remember going to Bhutan, and a little girl left, a family lived by this river way up high in the Himalayas, where the white heron, the white-bellied heron was, I think that's the name of it, is one of the most rare birds in the world. I mean, they were down to just dozens on this river. And I beckoned her over from her house. She was about 13. And I put my scope up there for her to see the herons right in the river. She put her eyes through. She came back, and it was like, and I said, "You never see this before?" And she went, she'd been living there all that time. And then I explained to somebody who translated to her that this was one of the rarest birds in the world. And people were trying to save it because the gravel in the river was disappearing because they were taking it out of the river for development. And the bird needs the gravel in the river in order to lay its eggs. And I mean, not lay its eggs, keep its young safe in the middle of the river. Anyway, so it's that kind of thing that happened. I saw it all over the world. So we can help anybody. I mean, I take kids out and educate them about what they're seeing in our backyard here. And so it's important to let people know what's in their backyard so they can feel the pride of what they have in their beautiful place. Very often it's quite beautiful. And then you help them preserve it, and help them understand what's in it for them. Now, it doesn't always mean that you're not going to have to allow them to kill certain things, because they have to eat. People have to eat. And if they live in very remote places, such as Papua New Guinea, and the Machi street kangaroo, which Lisa Daybeck is a great field biologist who's been studying the Machi street kangaroo for years. But she went to 45 villages to tell them what they had there and how it needed to be protected. And they said, but we eat that. We need to eat it. And she said, well, how many do you need to eat? And it worked out a plan that was sustainable. These are the kind of problems, that every problem is different all over the world with different animals and different people.
And I think that project is continuing today, if I'm not mistaken, and it's really successful in terms of helping finding that balance and connectedness.
It's enormously successful. Yeah. And Lisa Daybeck was absolutely tireless in her work with the communities, giving them health care, schools, what kinds of things that they needed to live and sustain themselves, so they could help sustain the Machi street kangaroo.
Yeah, the sort of basic building blocks. So speaking of connections in your own backyard, you took that to perhaps an extreme by adapting your home to live with bats, as I recall, in your home in New York. What was that like?
Well, they didn't squeak a lot, I have to say. This is the little brown bat, which is pretty common, or used to be. It has the white fungus disease now, the fungus that gets on the nose and unfortunately kills them. But they're not all gone yet, but we had many of them. My husband and I moved to Putnam County, New York, when the boys were younger, and we had a wonderful house on a stream. and with lots of big old deciduous trees. And we put up a bat house on the side of the house. It was instantly successful. The bats then moved into under the shingles and the roof. And then they got into the cathedral ceiling that we had in the living room. But you know, anybody who came in, I never wanted to freak people out because there were about, I'd say 20 big rivets on the beams of this cathedral ceiling. And the bats would just go in and kind of wrap themselves around the rivets. Not all the bats that were living under the shingles were in the house, but a significant number. And there was one big one that I used to name Henry because he was the only one that would come down into the room, maybe at 7 o'clock at night when I was reading, like that. Never harmed us, just looking for a bug or something, and then went back up. Well, I love bats. I think they're extraordinary little creatures. And they're also having big declines in the world for various reasons. And, but I didn't keep them. I mean, we had a new owner come in and buy the house that we'd lived in for 35 years. Ed and I moved out later, the boys were gone. And the new owner had a baby. And they said, do you think you could get rid of the bats? I said, of course I'll get rid of the bats. So I had a man come in and re-roof the house. And he said he stopped counting at 120 bats.
That's amazing. Well, as you know, nice to be doing nice things for bats. As you say, you know, many are declining, and they're also getting, you know, a bad rap these days because of their apparent link to COVID-19 and the coronavirus. But as we all know, I need to do more. You know, bats have such a critical role to play. So I think it's wonderful that you gave the little brown bats refuge.
Well, they were pretty quiet and secretive, and they didn't poop a lot. But the ones that people would freak out about were we had a porous foundation on the house, and the ringneck snakes would come in after they had bred, and the little babies were only about this big. And for some reason, they'd bring them into the house. I don't know why. And the babies would go around, but they were eating all the little stuff around the edges of the room. So I thought they were pretty cool, and I love to watch them.
That's great.
When people saw them, they would freak. Jeanette, I have to tell you one more thing about this because it's sort of fun. So I have a weasel living downstairs now in my house here in Nova Scotia, which also has a very old foundation from the 1800s. And the weasel just comes in when there's mice around. And there have been a lot of mice around this year. It's a big mouse year. So I'm living with the weasel because weasels are great mousers. And she is taking care of all the mice downstairs. I don't let her upstairs.
Wow. She knows her boundaries, but she's got a good place.
Yeah.
That's great. That's great. So you mentioned that there's some of these great field biologists. You've spent time with Alan Rabinowitz, George Schauer, George Archibald. You've worked with a number of organizations, including our colleague organization, the Wildlife Conservation Society. What do you think the conservation community as a whole is doing right? And what could we do better in your observation?
Oh, thank you, Jeanette. That's a really good question. I sure don't know all the answers, but I think we're all struggling with it right now. But certainly what is clear right now is that we need more diversity in all of our organizations so that people of all kinds can come and understand and see and be part of trips and learn about birds. There's a big movement now with Black Lives Matter for birds, and it's just great, all that they're doing. That's certainly number one, but from the top down, we all need to be more diverse that way in our organizations and in our experiences. And that will just make the world a much better place. The other thing that I think that we need to do is stop just talking to ourselves as much as possible. I mean, it's not an easy thing to do, but if I can talk to people in my community of the entertainment world and open their minds a little bit more about their own backyards, because that's what I'm always interested in, is people looking at their own backyards, seeing what they've got. And that their backyard can be in the city, it can be just a box that you put out with flowers or geraniums, and what comes to it. You'd be amazed what comes to them in New York City. I mean, peregrine falcons may rest on it, you know. So I think those are the main things. I think the organizations are doing terrifically compared to what they 50 years ago. It's just remarkable how much WWF, certainly it has been around, a wonderful Wildlife Conservation Society, which used to be the New York Zoological Society. And today there are thousands of organizations dedicated to protecting animals. And, you know, you can go online and there's one to protect sloths, you know.
No, you're right. And this is the diversity of organizations. So we would certainly agree with you about the importance of diversity in our work and in how we approach things, and in diversifying our own organization is a top priority for WWF, and it's so important. You know, and I'm glad you mentioned kind of, you know, getting beyond talking to ourselves, because I do find in conservation we are often preaching to the converted. And, you know, finding lasting solutions is really going to require connecting with whole new audiences and sectors, which is why we're so delighted to be speaking with you today. And, you know, really want to find new ways to do that. I'll just mention, you know, a couple of weeks ago, there was a really important study published out of the UK, the Dasgupta review, the economist who produced this massive report, Partha Dasgupta, on the economics of biodiversity, which really I think is going to be important in opening, we hope, you know, people's eyes at all levels around how nature is embedded in our economies, right? And you know, we risk economic collapse if we don't take care of nature. And so, you know, it's that kind of thing that I think is so important for us to really widen our aperture professionally to connect those dots in different ways, like in the economic sector.
Absolutely. I mean, look at COVID. Started probably with a couple of animals over in China and brought the whole thing down. And it's not the animals' fault. It's the fact that people capture them and eat them and don't leave them where they should be in their own habitat. But we have a lot to learn. And yeah, the economics of the future are what nature gives us. We've never really tried to value that in an economic sense, in a financial sense.
That's right.
From top to bottom. And why do we need it? Because the true thing is biodiversity is what keeps us all healthy, keeps some kind of quasi-balance going back and forth. That's what it means. It's our health, ultimately. Absolutely. And animals' health is our health.
For sure, and that's coming into strikingly sort of clear focus with COVID-19, right? And the unraveling of nature and the growing sort of intersection of people and wildlife when nature is destroyed, which can lead to this dangerous spillover of zoonotic diseases. And hopefully we have an opportunity here to use this to really talk about those critical connections. So I've got a couple more questions for you, and then I think we're going to open to the audience for a few. So there's a lot going on in the world, obviously, as we've talked about. And you mentioned this a bit, but say a bit more about what gives you hope and what inspires you, what keeps you positive these days?
Well, what gives me hope is the young people. I just find them extraordinary today. First of all, you don't have to sell them, most of them that I've talked to, you don't have to sell them on how much we need to protect the planet, how much we need to get to climate change and make the issues. They're right there with those issues already. So that gives me enormous hope. They're also awfully bright. I mean, they spend a lot of time online, but they're learning a lot too. It's too bad that they don't have the interchange, a lot of the young ones right now at school with their colleagues, but they will. So that gives me enormous hope. The other thing that gives me hope is, I don't know, I wake up every day and I see something remarkable. And that's what I'm kind of documenting in this day book that I'm doing right now, the daily year of COVID, which has been, the pandemic has been perfectly dreadful for so many people. But meanwhile, the world is going on. The world, the flora, fauna of the rest of the world is proceeding, and it's beautiful. It's very exciting. And it brings anybody who comes in contact with it joy. That's what I think. Yeah. And we need joy.
That's great. I have one final bonus question, and that is, what was it like to work with Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford in All the President's Men?
Okay. I thought you were going to say, what was it like to work with Dustin Hoffman? Because I think I told you the story of here I was in the hospital, and they had wheeled me into the wrong room, and they didn't know where I should go. And I'm on this gurney, and they leave me in the lobby while they go to find out where they're supposed to take me. And this guy comes in with his wife through the doors, looks at me and says, "Jane Alexander, what was it like to work with Dustin Hoffman?" Oh God, I couldn't answer that when I was so exhausted. Anyway.
Thank you for indulging
Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford are tops. I mean, I did other movies with each of them. I did Brubaker with Robert, and I did Kramer versus Kramer with Dustin. And yeah, they're just tops. I mean, and Redford is major conservationist, environmentalist, wildlife.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And well, thank you so much, both. Who knew that this conversation could stimulate my love for the environment and Robert Redford? So very enjoyable for me. But we did have a couple of audience questions that come in, and please, attendees, continue to use the chat feature if you have any questions for Jane. We have time for a couple. So Jane, this question is for you. And it is, were you ever given any scripts that involved the natural world where you would have played a conservationist or a scientist? And then also, second to that is, what was your most personally impactful role that you played on stage or on screen? Kind of a two-parter.
Oh, good question. I was always looking for roles that had to do with going out into the elements and being an explorer, a biologist. That's why I was writing the Jaguar script, which, by the way, never happened. And then when I heard Gorillas in the Mist was going to be done, I was desperate to play the part of Diane Fossey. But it went to Sigourney, and she was sublime. She couldn't have done have a better choice than Sigourney Weaver. So I didn't get to do that. The role that was probably, I feel, most impactful may not have been a role that a movie that was widely seen by a lot of people, but Testament was a movie about the end of the world. I had been working for a long time against nuclear weapons stockpiles and radioactivity, the poisonous nature of radioactivity. And this was a movie about the bombs hitting all over. You didn't know it was all about one family and one small community in California. And then it was about radiation poisoning in the weeks that followed the nuclear bombs hitting the earth. I found it an extremely remarkable film. It was based on a story by a woman named Carol Amen. And it said everything that I felt I ever wanted to say or learn about the danger of nuclear weapons. And so I would say Testament was the one that was most impactful. Of course, Kramer versus Kramer took on the subject of divorce, and that the a priori rights were not necessarily always going to go to women, went to men, you know, so.
Well, we actually have a former screenwriter on staff, so maybe we'll tap him to write a play where you can play Jeanette. That's your next gig, Jane. So we actually have had a couple more questions come through, and this one I'm really interested to hear from either of you, actually. The environmental community has relied heavily on nonfiction, documentary-style storytelling, but are we missing an opportunity to inspire imagination through fiction?
With what? With
through fiction.
Through fiction. Oh, I think that's a great question. I'll let Jeanette go after I do, but let me, I think it's a wonderful question, and I couldn't agree more, but the truth is, we have a literature arena which is not really focusing very much on this kind of fiction. The writers aren't writing it, perhaps, but more important, the publishers aren't publishing it. And then you get to the bookstores, and it's hard, they're hard to find. Now, there was a wonderful one called The Overstory about trees, Richard Power, I believe, book a few years ago. And that was great, but I don't think that there's any plans to make a film about it. I don't know. Jeanette, what do you think?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I fully agree. I mean, I think there are big opportunities, you know, going the fiction route. And, we have occasionally had the opportunity from WWF to share story ideas with television series, themes. Those always seem to be quite popular, at least what I'm recalling. I think we could just do more of that. I mean, it is such a huge outlet and so important. So for sure, there are opportunities that we could do more with bridging and finding the right people to help us do that, as you're suggesting as well, right? That's key.
Yes, and I would like to add one other writer who well, Ann Patchett has quite a wonderful book that takes place in the tropics. And then Barbara Kingsolver is always writing wonderful stuff about nature. I always thought those books would, other than the Poisonwood Bible, which did become a film, that they should be films, but they haven't been.
Another question, as a writer, language and prose is so important, and you actually highlight the importance of words and language in your book, how you chose to capitalize animal names, for example. In looking at how conservation groups communicate and choose language, how are we doing? Are there ways that we could use language better to engage more people?
Boy, that's a great, yes, indeed. I mean, science has its own language. It's like the art world, the visual art world has, I don't know how to read a visual art book that's a critique of art and all, because I can't figure out the language that they're writing in. It's their own little thing. And I think scientists do have that. I mean, we have to understand, of course, there's Latin names for species and there has to be rules and regulations. But what's the one that always bothers me? Instead of just talking about nature and the benefits from nature, it's economic services, or what is it, Jeanette?
Ecosystem services.
Ecosystem services.
That is a mouthful.
Yeah. Yeah, I would just add that this goes to I think the point we were talking about earlier of us talking to ourselves too much. We get caught up in our own jargon, and even, I mean, ecosystem services, yeah, we know what it means, but it doesn't mean much to most people.
Yeah.
Even the word biodiversity is a challenge. We talked about that, right? I mean, is it enough just to say nature, right? Biodiversity has a scientific definition, and it's important, but I think we have to get better at simplifying, clarifying, and speaking kind of more, sort of user-friendly way too. So,
Yeah, yeah, biodiversity, the variety of creatures, the variety of life.
right, absolutely.
Great. And then one final question for both of you before we close. Since our attendees are avid readers and love to read, what books are on your reading lists now, and what would you recommend?
Well, I'm almost always reading nonfiction, nature writing. Right now I'm reading Carl Safina's latest book, Becoming Wild, which is sublime, wonderful. And then I have Helen McDonald's McDonald, is it? Yeah, new book on my Kindle, that kind of thing.
Well, it's funny. Carl Safina was on my list too, because he's such a great writer, and it seems like every book he outdoes himself. And I also have Becoming Wild on my list. Outside of the realm of natural history, which I incline to also. I've been wanting to read the book Leadership by Doris Kearns Goodwin, only because leadership is such an important topic today in our politically divided world, and so that's something I hope to get to in the coming weeks.
Yeah, great.
Well, thank you both again. Jeanette, you certainly lead our work so boldly. So thank you so much for all that you do and for taking the time to be with us here today. Jane, it was such an honor to have you as our first guest. We're so appreciative. And to all our attendees, thank you so much for joining us for our inaugural Pandas in Prose. Please join us next month for next month's installment. Also, be sure to check out the website worldwildlife.org, where we'll have the recording made available following this event. Thank you so much, everyone, for taking this break in your day with us, and stay well and happy reading.
Thank you. And thanks again, Jane.
Thank you, Jeanette. It was a pleasure talking.
Enjoyed it.
Thank you both so much. Take care.